gentle listener, and welcome to Nocturnal Transmissions, the fortnightly podcast that brings you dark tales both old and new, performed by voice artist Kristin Holland. My mission is to create a world where we can live in harmony with nature. Jane Goodall. I would feel more optimistic about a bright future for man if he spent less time proving that he can outwit nature and more time tasting her sweetness and respecting her seniority. E.B. White. I believe in God, only I spell it. Nature. Frank Lloyd Wright. Nature. Red in tooth and claw. Tennyson. Nocturnal Transmissions is proud to present Old Man Winter by Dan Fields. Buck Leavenworth was not a man who ran from much. He stood a medium height with modest portions of wiry muscle on him, but he had the kind of poise and spirit that bold men use to get ahead. What he could not overpower by plain cussed force, he could bullyrag into submission. Many of the folks he had robbed, abused, and taken advantage of were so dazed by his masterful manner that only after he'd left them did it occur to them to feel harshly done by. Of course, none of that held up in the presence of timber wolves. With a full and hungry pack of Canis lupus occidentalis on his heels, Buck had sense enough to run. Being caught off guard by a late winter squall was a serious inconvenience, and Buck already had a twist in his prick over having to flee from the law before breakfast. 2 eager young constables of the Northwest Mounted Police had shown up unannounced at his doorstep, so to speak. The recent decline of Buck's fortunes, which left him still better off than many, had meant moving from his regular digs at the 3rd cheapest room of the Yukon Hotel at 1st Avenue and Church Street to a moldy storeroom out back of a gambling den 6 miles up along the big river toward 40 Mile. Had Buck not excused himself outdoors for a cold water shave and a piss, he'd have had the chance before departing to grab his Colt revolver and a handful of the ill-gotten cash which the Mounties had presumably shown up to seize. Of course, had he still been dozing in bed, he might not have seen them coming in time to light out at all. He'd had the foresight at least to don his good boots and throw a heavy coat over his Union flannels. His path of escape prevented him from borrowing a horse off the hitching post, his own mare having been recently stolen off him by men of even lower character than himself. He ran without even the reassurance of his razor, poor and pitted thing though it was, which he had set down on a rock to rinse his beard before carving at it. No doubt, by the time he reached sufficient cover to catch his breath in safety, the constables had conducted their raid and gotten what they came for. Buck made a private note to bust the teeth of Mona Blackeyes, the faithless gin house girl he felt sure had given his location up to the officials over an unconnected personal grievance. He was weighing the risks of circling back to Dawson City to claim any outstanding favors, or pushing on toward some new and more remote hideaway, when 2 sounds interrupted his thoughts. The first was a shriek of northerly wind announcing a sudden unfriendly turn in the weather. The second was a long, unmistakable howl. Buck scarcely had time to brace himself against an advancing curtain of snow before he perceived 6 black figures converging on his vicinity, keeping low to the ground on their hairy paws. As he turned tail to run, having no idea of his heading, Buck reflected that he'd gladly give the whole of his hot bankroll for a few rounds of lead to frighten the beasts away. All he had to save him were a pair of feet that had all but lost the habit of quick getaways. The next 20 minutes were a philosophical revelation. The value Buck placed on his own hide was evident in how quickly he managed to flee from the pursuing wolves. Every instant he expected to be overtaken, until he supposed the animals must be playing with him, holding back for the sport of it. Even so, their snorts and growls were so close he thought he could feel rancid dog breath warm on his bare palms. As the fire in his lungs, legs, and belly threatened to give out, he ran flat into salvation. In fact, he gave himself a smart bang on the head, knocking enough snow from the side of what looked like a great jutting boulder to reveal it was a tiny, tumble-down cabin. The door swung aside at his touch, and finding a hearth of coals burning inside, however faintly, Buck was so relieved that he'd stoked the fire nicely up before he spied the old man in a low bed against a wall, not 5 feet away, buried in furs and scraps of wool. The rousted sleeper appeared neither displeased nor shocked to have company. Buck fumbled with a rough apology for his intrusion, wondering at first from the glassy cast of the eyes whether he had barged in on a blind man. "I had no aim to steal up on you, mister, only it's turned ugly on me outside, and I found your door unbolted." A sudden blink and dart of those eyes let Buck know that they saw well enough, though Buck still had no certainty of the man's demeanor or condition. What prudence lay in living alone among the forsaken trees, Buck could not say. Taking himself for the more solid specimen of the two, he began to relax in the healing glow of the fire. Yet before he could name what had driven him into the storm, the yelp of a wolf prowling outside, too near for Buck's comfort, stopped his account short.
"Don't let them trouble you,"
said the old man in a birdy rasp. It was a voice not in regular use, one which needed tuning like an old fiddle after long periods of neglect. It matched the fellow's near invisibility in his own bed. Buck's first impression was a familiar mix of age, sickness, and sleep. The remark was so peculiar that he wondered again about the soundness of the stranger's mind. The century had turned, and the gold rush was going stale. Most new arrivals, the tail end of what could still be called the Klondike Stampeders, had come far too late. They fed on a thin gruel of bad promises and outsized bonanza rumors. The bulk of those Buck encountered were starving gradually on their missed chances. Buck himself had been unofficial foreman on 2 productive claims in a row. This meant he took in a goodly profit off the sweat of others more weak-willed and better suited to hard labor than himself. He oversaw, he prodded, he wheedled, and strong-armed. When those incomes dried up, he had subsisted by picking the bones of hapless, often desperate tenderfeet, willing to pay unfair sums for the basic nourishment, guidance, and protection which they lacked the intelligence or grit to sort out for themselves. Buck did not view the change from mining boss to little more than a trail bandit as a degradation of his morals or class. It was a professional transition, the final sweep of gold dust into his pockets before he struck southward for the next profitable setup. He had run with various outfits, ganged and thieved and split shares in his time, but running solo had turned out to suit him best. It made for simplified economics and eliminated the need to trust overmuch in one's fellow creatures. The bony party in the bed was a snowbound prospector, no question, living on the fine edge of starvation by the looks of his environment. The most good he could do the world would be as food for the snarling wolf pack at his door. Someday those canine bastards were bound to find their way inside. Buck had known several such luckless men, and had deftly bilked them out of the scant resources they had not spent or eaten up. Feeling his composure return as the outdoor noise began to soften, he scanned the cabin's interior out of a homegrown instinct for finding goods worth stealing. He discovered more in the dull flicker of hearth coals than he had expected. Various nails, pegs, fragments of wire and bone were pushed into the cabin walls at crude angles and irregular intervals. On them hung a queer assortment of items, some of a value beyond the common trifles and gimcracks traded by natives or tosspot French furriers. On a loop of plain twine dangled a delicate gold ring. Buck, had he been so inclined, would have presented it to any white woman as a token of fond esteem. There were like bits of finery in plain view among the odds and ends. Buck's gaze halted a moment on a startling little face that peered from behind a strand of elk's teeth. The face belonged to a doll which any child would have dearly loved to have as a plaything in those bleak surroundings. Higher up along the eaves, a row of hooks held more practical implements. Among them a rusty saw and a pair of broken game traps. At the end were 3 empty spaces where more traps might once have hung. If the old man had any sense, he'd have put them outside to keep the wolves at a safe distance.
Time put the supper on,
the old man mumbled as he thrust aside a blanket of some indeterminate and poorly tanned hide.
Lend a hand, young fella, if you'll share in my cook fire.
Buck hoped the mournful song of his empty stomach was not audible to his host. He did not yet feel he had the advantage of the situation, even being the younger and presumably more savvy man. He held an arm out for the other to grasp in a sinewy claw and hoist himself up. If Buck was wiry, the old man was all steel cable. He might have been run off the line by Carnegie or Dominion and shipped west to haul mine trains. Encircling the aged forearm with his thumb and forefinger, Buck felt a shiver in his guts. He had expected a brittle bird skeleton. Instead, he gripped a hardness and weight that was almost cruelly cold to the touch. Buck would have felt more comfortable jostling a loaded Springfield rifle. Once upright on his pair of skeleton legs, the old man released Buck abruptly, his expression shrewd, as if he'd read some of Buck's fortune in the momentary touch. He thrust a pair of gnarled feet into shaggy moccasins. He was not old, but ancient, thought Buck, watching him shuffle across the groaning floor. The long white hair and beard must have weighed more than the rest of him. On one hip he wore a little medicine bag of furry hide. Buck thought it must be snow hair. The old man hung a small cookpot over the spitting fire, then turned to where Buck stood against the cabin door. He reached past without a word, tugging at a cracked leather thong fixed up as a door pull, with a loose end that could be lashed around a deer antler nailed to the wall. This acted like a sailor's cleat for fastening the door against the outside. Buck shivered at the notion of the old man letting his door sit unbolted with bad men, bad weather, and bad wolves outside. He stiffened as he realized the old man meant to get by him. "You're not going out there," Buck blurted. "That passel of wolves is sure to be hanging around."
"And why not?"
the old man retorted, as though expecting nothing less.
"It's their hunting ground."
One pouchy buzzard's eye twinkled, shifting Buck's insides a little. Before Buck could protest, he found himself lightly shoved aside. The old man threw the door wide and strode to a small root bin just outside. Stooping, he pulled from it a handful of the most pitiful, cancerous-looking gray-skinned potatoes Buck had ever seen. Then he reached above the door frame and tugged loose a sizable chuck of ice. He came back inside, unmindful of yellow eyes like candle flame in pairs watching the men from the edge of the visible outdoors. He slammed the door to, not bothering to tie it shut. Buck himself contemplated doing so, but as no wolf had stolen up on the cabin, he would have felt a coward and a fool before his host. The old man threw the ice into the pot to melt, followed by the tubers to boil. "Do you find it lonesome, old-timer?" Buck inquired. "Living away out in the woods, with so little to eat, hard up against the grain of nature?" He spoke with gentle, mocking humor, unprepared for the energy of the reply.
Man is perfectly fit to live in nature, same as any other beast.
The old man spoke with the heat of conviction, waving a bony, upraised finger.
Provided he comes in the proper attitude.
How's that now?
Not prideful, not scornful as a man's apt to enter the forest. He must come with the dignity of a fellow animal, without greed, reverent before sun, stone, and blood alike.
Outside the cabin, two of the wolves yipped at one another. Not full-on moon howls, but enough to shiver the backbone loose from Buck's ribcage. One corner of the old man's mouth rose nearly to the level of his ear, quick as a snake.
"They like the smell of supper cooking,"
he growled.
"even when it's only spuds yet."
The careless manner of the comment amused Buck. He cocked his head and regarded the old man with bemused interest. "You don't strike me as a man who much enjoys the company of town folk, that's sure enough." The old man breathed hard from his nose, almost hissing.
"Civilization's a fine trick, like a circus pony stood upright, and no more practical than a leap through a burning barrel hoop."
He laughed, with a little more thunder than he looked like his body could hold. Buck, who'd thought his new acquaintance a trifle soft-headed at first, now perceived the flash of more serious and malign madness. Buck had seen that face of Yukon life, too, and stayed clear of it when adverse weather and roving carnivores did not compel him to sit in cozy company with it. Hunger drove people mad, as did sorrow, and sometimes a fractured soul simply wriggled from its mother's belly to walk the earth.
"It's no wonder you got so turned about by a common snow billow, then buffaloed by a scrawny old wolf pack."
The old man fairly spat.
"Men like you don't give a mule skinner's cuss for creation. These here woods that stood 100,000 times your age ain't nothing to you but some mud-crusted hidey-hole to bury your trinkets in. You wouldn't know what direction the wind come from if it blew out of your sorry ass."
"Easy, friend," said Buck with dangerous calm. He was losing any compunction about snapping the cabin-crazy old man in two, using both arms if necessary. If this was the only companionship the blizzard could offer, Buck would take his chances doing without.
"A man has no cause to fear the wilderness once he learns to live as part of it," the old man continued more softly. "Not as master of it, not as exception to it, not against it in any way. Take what you will, but mind you give back anything you can spare. The wilderness weighs a man's heart, tastes it. It chooses to keep him or swallow him."
Buck pressed himself involuntarily against the cabin wall. Surely there was no sense in the old fool's words, yet his tone had such dreadful clarity to it that Buck found himself moved by something lurking beneath reason.
"I've been tasted," said the old man, "and found worthy."
The eyes peering between wild mane and wizened beard seemed to glow with life, yet with each glance they faded toward utter colorlessness. Buck felt something new. Even with the door shut, the room grew colder. Not the room exactly, but the space between them. It was as if the old man's breath came as a soft, chilly breeze. Once, during a spell of months when he was flush enough to lie low, Buck had kept company with a Tuchoni girl who lived in mortal fear of the Witico. Her village had starved out, or possibly died of fever, which drove her to the low dens of Dawson City, and she claimed to have looked that ravenous cannibal spirit of the north in its pale eyes. When she could not be kept quiet with liquor or stern reproaches, the half-addled Indian would mutter incessantly about that creature as a way of warding it off. Buck tolerated her because she kept herself well-fed and soft, another talisman against a demon of hunger, which had the added effect of keeping Buck plenty warm in those lazy days. Now, all memories of warmth vanished in the old man's frigid gaze. He was flesh and blood, solid enough, but his rangy frame and jaundiced eyeballs put Buck in mind of the nightmares he'd caught like the Yukon clap of his long-gone gal. The old man had awaited him in his poorly made bed to conserve energy, perhaps play-acting at infirmity, but his diabolical soundness was manifest now. He was not ancient as he'd seemed before. A better word for it was ageless. Buck had hated the superstitious prattle of his Tuchoni woman, not because it was nonsense, but because he believed at least a kernel of it. He did not need to live in the wilderness to understand such a legend, for as a man he had witnessed it merely by living among his fellows. Whether men's bloody minds conjured actual evil spirits into being, or their bloody deeds transfigured them into what they dreaded, the Witico walked and devoured the world as true as any pack of wolves. It was indistinguishable from a normal man until after its claws had snagged what they wanted. Nearly time now, the old man grumbled. Seated on his cot, wreathed in steam from the boiling stew pot, he did not sweat a drop. His knitted brow looked as dry as a burnt stump. With a sweeping conjurer's hand, he pulled the hareskin bag from his hip and emptied its contents over the top of a little cask that served him for a table. A meaningless jumble of dice, buttons, and tiny bones clattered loose. The old man gathered them with another swipe of his grasping paw, shook them and threw them. Bending low, he read them like a witch, muttering some unintelligible phrase all the while. Buck's gaze was fixed on the same spot, not to divine the stars, but because he realized at a second glance what the odd bits of bone were. They were finger joints, varying in size and all on the small side, but fingers without question. That got him peering around the old man's living quarters again, with a fresh perspective. The conglomeration of objects on display took sinister shape, the grotesque pieces now more apparent than the friendly ones. He stopped the swivel of his gaze on a weathered antique musket leaning against the wall behind him amid a looping tangle of the same leather strands the old man had fixed up to work the door. A fresh howl from outside ran a plug of ice through Buck's heart. It was too queer a sound for an ordinary wolf to make, so against all intuition he took it for a trick of the wind. His mind leapt back to a fragment of his fitful Bible schooling, where butchered Abel's blood cried out to God for vengeance against bad brother Cain. The toys and baubles hung on the wall above the bed seemed to vibrate with bloody anguish. He saw some of the tools the man had fashioned himself had bone handles, and they did not all give the impression of coming from trapped wolves, rabbits, or magpies. The valuables were not trade goods, and not fit possessions for a solitary old hermit to keep, at least not one without the faintest smack of sentiment for humankind. Buck saw it all anew. The place was bestrewn with trophies, and, like as not, the cabin itself was the same. The old man had taken it off whatever poor murdered souls had dwelt there before. It stank from floorboards to roof with guilty blood. God alone knew where else besides the sack on his hip the mad old son of a bitch kept human bones for his use. Men, women, children. Their fates, hidden perhaps even from God's eye in that frozen hell. When the old man pushed his blanket back to show the bone-handled hatchet he kept as a bunkmate, Buck felt his body move even in the days of shock. He made straight for the gun on the wall, thrusting a ready right hand through the tangle of slings to grasp it. He had not fought his way out of close quarters in some time, but if the gun would not fire, he was glad to swing it in defense of his life. Buck's fingers closed on the barrel, and he yanked, but came up short. The gun was fixed to the cabin timbers by a heavy iron staple, difficult to see in the poor firelight. Buck's instant of hesitation allowed the old man to grab a loose end of leather thong and pull it taut, binding Buck to the wall at his wrist and elbow. Buck flailed in panic like a brown trout, but a hard blow at the base of his neck settled him down a little. The old man had clubbed him with the hatchet, using the blunt side of the head to stun him. His head thrummed and his vision broke for several seconds into mirror shards. By the time he felt in command of himself again, the bindings on his arm were tight enough to stop blood, lashed to the antler by the door in a rude tourniquet. Buck felt a jolt and a rush of cold. The cabin door was open, and the bulk of himself had been pushed forward into snow and wind. Buck moaned something, no coherent curse finding his lips. The old man stood against the door, trapping Buck's arm inside the cabin and the rest of him just outside. Buck could not turn to face his attacker or grapple in any useful way with his free left arm. Scratching at the door behind his back, he barked a pair of knuckles and drove a mean splinter up under his thumbnail.
"Live with nature,"
the old man said, gesturing through the gap in the door toward the ghostly line of trees beyond.
"Share in what it brings, hardship and good fortune alike. In this way shall ye know peace." As ghastly understanding dawned on Buck, the hatchet began to bite. Buck only counted 3 strokes, though his faculties in the moment were suspect. If a man kept a hatchet that sharp under his bedclothes, he was a man who slept soundly and still. The sermon ended, the offering of hand and arm taken for the stew pot, the old man turned the rest of Buck loose and shut the door behind him. The prospect of being let back in held no water. Surely at last the old man would have fastened the entrance to take his meal in private. Dazed and dangerously sapped of blood, Buck nearly collapsed under a snowy gust against the cabin's front. The dwelling shuddered, but held its ground. Seeking a point to focus for his fading vision, wishing to see anything but the rising white tide of snow cover,
Buck perceived hard lines of rusty black in a crude semicircle around the front of the cabin. Iron animal traps, the ones missing from inside, the ones not yet twisted and broken open by struggling, man-sized prey. They were set and ready, not for the wolves, but for their benefit. One might easily have snared Buck's ankle as he ran to the cabin, an ugly chance that would have allowed the wolves to take their share that day before the old man had his chance. No matter, Buck reflected dimly as he watched yellow eyes emerge from the storm and furry, slavering snouts take solid form around them. He might be gaunt, that old ghoul, but he was patient as a spider. Some days it might only have been the wolves who ate, but there were more of them to feed. They were good and faithful hunters, letting the old man take his fair cut of the meat. He had enough to live on, and demanded no more. "Share in what it brings you," he had said. And hadn't the wolves chased Buck right to the cabin door? They'd run him just as smart as a kennel of foxhounds. Buck would never grasp the full measure of whatever mad bargain had been struck in the winter woods. The old man was not off the pack, but had settled himself alongside them as a good neighbor. The silent approach of the animals told Buck all he wanted or needed to understand. Two of them flanked around the area set with traps, ready to take him from either side in case he would not run straight. Their control would not last long, not with Buck's vitality leaving him in spurts to form a red moat around his boots in the snow. All over Dawson and Whitehorse, even down to Skagway in his best years, Buck Leavenworth was a man whose name commanded the respectful notice of his peers. Out here, though, he was a man alone, miles from the false dominion of humankind, which he knew how to court and how to skirt. He was no more than a late supper for beasts, and men more beastly than himself. And a modest portion at that. He might be savory on their tongues, but whatever they tasted on him would not be worthiness. The feast went long into the night. Before its end, the snow had drifted high enough to hide the loving cup of blood, poured out before a ramshackle hut which disappeared once more from view, until the next hunt. An old man slept soundly on a full stomach. The wolves bedded down in a separate place, the whereabouts of their den unknown even to their benefactor. Yet all of them dreamed the same dreams together. Man and wolves. Not keeper and animals, not lord and beasts. Only nature. A shared nature. It was a night like any other. In the wilderness. Old Man Winter by Dan Fields. Why, yes, gentle listener, this is the same Dan Fields who brought us Do Not Resuscitate, episode 57, and Axe Mama in episode 65. Although, of course, it's only our beloved Patreon subscribers who are lucky, or perhaps unlucky, enough to hear that one in its entirety. If you wish to become a supporter of Nocturnal Transmissions by subscribing through Patreon, just visit patreon.com/Nocturnal Transmissions and sign up. All our exclusive content will be yours to enjoy. You can find out more about our featured author, Dan Fields, in the Featured Authors section of our website, nocturnaltransmissions.com.au. Now, before we get to our latest installment of Nocturnal Transmissions Recommends, let's say hello to our latest acolytes, Stephanie Soloka and Austin Cooter. Hello, and welcome. All right, all formalities aside, it's time for Nocturnal Transmissions Recommends. I think it would be fairly safe to assume that you, gentle listener, by virtue of your presence here as a consumer, as it were, of our humble production, are not unfamiliar with the podcast medium, and may, in fact, actually be, not to put too fine a point on it, an enthusiast. Well, if it's podcast entertainment you're seeking, we have a suggestion for you. Now, by way of preparing you for what I'm about to say, I acknowledge that the matter we generally recommend in this segment is, as a rule, of a dark nature. However, we are in dark times, and, well, our humble narrator thought it might be nice to share something sunny with you, to lift your spirits. So, what is this sunny diversion that has elicited such obvious prevarication on my part? Well, it is, I am just as surprised as you are, gentle listener, the 9-part podcast series, Dolly Parton's America. Yes, gentle listener, on this rare occasion, our humble narrator is uncharacteristically quite right. Dolly Parton's America is, quite simply, well, captivating. Now, this is not a podcast by Dolly Parton. It is a podcast about Dolly Parton, her life, her career, her impact on American culture, and further abroad. It's quite thought-provoking, gentle listener, and moving, and, well, entertaining. Whether you're a fan of country music, America, Dolly Parton for that matter, or not, this podcast is a rewarding listen, gentle listener. Dip your toe in the water, you'll see what we mean. Dolly Parton's America. Nocturnal Transmissions recommends it. This episode was brought to you with the generous assistance of our cohorts, Evan Dewley, Robert Troy Hampton Peterson, Sam Bell, and Michael Wood. Sadly, Sanitarium magazine will no longer be able to continue as a cohort of Nocturnal Transmissions. This marvelous little publication, with which we have been proud to be associated, is pulling up stumps, as it were. They tell me there is the possibility of one last issue, but we'll just have to cross our fingers and hope for the best on that one. Vale, Sanitarium magazine. On a lighter note, if you would like to have your business mentioned as an official cohort of Nocturnal Transmissions, just visit patreon.com/Nocturnal Transmissions and sign up. It's all explained there on our page. All right, enough of that. All non-public domain stories are featured with the permission of the authors. All voices and production are concocted by Kristin Holland. Until next time, as always, watch the skies, fear the dark, and don't trust anyone, especially yourself. Good night, gentle listener.